I mean, just look at this description. Turn into a human stick? That sounds hella spicy. That's exactly the sort of dark shit I'm into. Sign me up! Or at least that was my initial reaction, because I kept seeing it pop up on my AO3, Archive of Our Own, and my friend recommended it as well. So I thought, okay, why not give it a try? Unfortunately, the rest of the summary doesn't really... It's a sort of summary that I can only describe as having chaotic crackhead energy. So I sort of forgot about it for a long time until The Untamed sort of started making its way around the internet and on TV, and that got really, really popular. I think for those who are in fandomish circles, you would have seen that fandom sort of slowly invading your Twitter and Tumblr. Basically, if you see two dudes dressed up in like old school kind of fantastical Chinese clothing, and one is like this cheeky red guy and the other one is this straight-laced person in white, that's The Untamed. So this made me sort of think to myself like, okay, I should really give it a try. So I went online again, just entirely ignored the crappy summary and zoom straight into the novel. Of course, instead of going into The Untamed or the other more famous work by the same author, which was, I believe the name, Heaven Official's Blessing, I decided instead to start with her very, very first novel, which is Scum Villain, or to be more accurate, Scum Villain Self-Saving System. It's a bit of a mouthful, so I'm just going to go with SV or Scum Villain from now on. I went with that one first. I read it and just couldn't stop reading. And you don't understand, like, to be able to find a fandom that I just completely find myself being sucked in by, it's pretty rare nowadays. When I was younger, like I guess in junior high school or high school, oh my god, I would have maybe like 10 to 15 fandoms at the same time. I would have all these fics and art that I could read. But as you grow older, maybe like your tastes change, or you just become a bit more like picky with what you consume. I find it pretty rare to fall in love as passionately as I did back then into any sort of media. And so with Scum Villain, that was what happened. I couldn't every day after I finished work, I would just rush straight back home, open up the novel on my phone, and just zoom through chapter after chapter. Chinese web novels, it's pretty common for the work to have almost 100 plus chapters, and I think I finished it in a few days. I could not stop reading. With that out of the way, that is why I want to drag all of you down with me into Scum Villain Hell by our Lord and Savior MXTX. I might have thrown out some terms earlier that might be a bit confusing, so I apologize for that. I'm going to go through hopefully all of them now and try and explain them to all of you. So MXTX. MXTX is the writer of 3 novels, Scum Villain, The Untamed, and her most recent one, Heaven Official's Blessing. Out of all her 3 works, the most popular one right now would be The Untamed, as I've mentioned before. It has the TV series, a manhwa, which is a manga. It has an anime adaptation as well, which was also fairly well received. And it also has 2 audio dramas. Okay, not 1, but 2. In Chinese and Japanese. And I guess you could say for a BL drama, it has gotten pretty mainstream. I mean, there are all these articles and websites talking about it. And at this point, I think it sits as the highest rated drama on my drama list. Her most recent work, Heaven Official's Blessing, is also gaining a lot of traction recently because there's an anime adaptation slated for release, and there's been a few trailers for it right now floating around. It also has the highest score, I think, on JJWCX. That's kind of the Chinese version of of Wattpad, you could say, where people post their novels online. In addition to that, Heaven Official's Blessing was also picked up for a record-breaking $5,900,000 US dollars. So, yep. Meanwhile, Scum Villain, oh boy, this is the salty fan in me emerging. Meanwhile, Scum Villain has almost nothing. Okay, I might be exaggerating. It doesn't really have nothing. It had a manhwa at one point that was running, but that got cut off pretty fast. It's supposed to be on indefinite hiatus, but due to some drama that went down, it's pretty much, I would just say it's pretty much cancelled at this point in time. It was also supposed to have a tonghua at one point, an anime adaptation, and there were a few trailers for it out on YouTube. But that has also sort of just been sitting in the microwave for a very, very long time. So you can understand why all of the Scum Villain fans are kind of like, just imagine all of us sort of standing on the sidelines while the fans in The Untamed and the Heaven Official's Blessings are just like having a party in the distance with all of the adaptations they're getting and all of the money getting thrown on these adaptations, while Scum Villain is just sitting there like, okay, I guess we'll just continue waiting for a while longer then. Like, I want to try and bring over some people on our side. Like, please join us. You know, MXTX wrote 3 works. She didn't just write The Untamed and Heaven Official's Blessing. She wrote Scum Villain too. But the problem is that everyone seems to forget about this. Everyone just sees The Untamed and the Heaven Official's Blessing and sort of just like zoom straight past Scum Villain as if it never even existed. And I kind of get why that might happen. Firstly, it's just because it doesn't have as much exposure because there's only the novel at this point compared to the other 2 works, which has all this shiny stuff going on. Like, wow, you can read the novel, or, you know, if you don't feel like you have the time to go through a freaking 100+ chapter novel, you can try out the anime, or just listen to the audio drama, or even watch the live adaptation. And with Heaven Official's Blessing, all of these things are due to be released as well. But with Scum Villain, you only have the novel and that's it, which is, I'm gonna be fair, it is quite a huge commitment to make. Secondly, Scum Villain is her very first novel. It's her first work, which is why people have cited, and I've seen this like reasons being said online, that it's not as technically proficient as her other 2 novels, that the characterization and the plot isn't as strong, and so on. Or people they just bounced off of it, which is fair, I guess. They just couldn't get into it. They preferred The Untamed or Heaven Official's Blessing. But my job here today, as someone who always has a Scum Villain agenda, is to try and convince all of you to give it a try. You know, just give it a try. In Scum Villain, the main character is this dude called Shen. Shen basically finds himself being transported into a novel called Proud Immortal Demon's Way. That's the gist of Scum Villain. Someone finds themselves being yeeted or sucked into a fictional book. If you're not an army, if you're a fan, this sounds kind of familiar. If you know what self-insert fics are, you know, where you write yourself into a popular work, for example, Naruto or Harry Potter, and you write yourself being a part of that work. That's basically the plot of Scum Villain. For the normies out there, it's sort of a portal fantasy. So, like the closest equivalent I can think of is something like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. You find yourself being relocated somewhere else into another world. Or in Scum Villain's case, Shen Yuan finds himself being transmigrated into this fictional novel that he was reading. So instead of transportation, in Chinese web novels, usually the term that they use is transmigration. Another comparison I can make is isekai, the isekai genre, like Sword Art Online and so on, where the main character, once again, they just find themselves in another world, and usually they also go through this sort of glow up. So they're usually like normal or useless or a bit of a loser in the previous world that they come in, but then in the new one, they perhaps find themselves having superpowers or being able to use the knowledge that they have from the original world in ways that give them more of a higher standing in the new world they find themselves in. The problem, however, with Shen Yuan being transported into Proud Immortal Demon's Way, and holy crap, that's another long title. I'm just gonna call it Demon's Way from now on. The problem with this is that Demon's Way is not actually a good book. In fact, it's pretty shitty. Think of Twilight or 50 Shades of Grey or My Immortal. It's a shitty novel. It's rife with terrible tropes. The girls walk around just a step or two and all their clothes are falling off. The main protagonist of the novel is super OP. All the villains are basically cardboard villains who just monologue and have zero to no characterization at all. Plot lines go nowhere. It's pretty much the term that is given in the official summary. It's a stallion novel. So stallion novels are, I guess you could call it, they're kind of harem novels. They're not actually supposed to be known for the plot. You read it and you have a protagonist who is basically supposed to be a male power fantasy. Shen Yuan pretty much hate reads this novel, and that by itself was already quite relatable, because I too have done the same thing where a novel or a TV show or whatnot is really shit, but somehow you can't stop. And this is the same position that Shen Yuan finds himself in. He really hates Demon's Way to the point that he's a bit of an infamous fan. He's gone online to shit on this novel. The problem is that he hates it so very much that when he dies, I guess like the hatred that he has is so strong that it somehow coalesces around him, and he ends up reincarnating or waking up in the world of Demon's Way in the novel. The other big problem with this is he finds himself waking up in the body of the villain, Qingqiu. In Demon Way, Qingqiu's fate was to be carved into a human stick. Yep, that's right, a human stick. Basically, all of his arms and limbs, eyes, tongue, whatnot, gets torn off in the end. That's the fate of the villain. So obviously, Shen Yuan, as Qingqiu at this moment, is like, hell no, that's not gonna be my fate. So he uses all of the knowledge that he has spent from hate reading this novel, Demon's Way, for hours and hours and days and months and years on end. He uses all of this knowledge to try and find a way to avoid himself from being turned into a human stick. However, that is not as easy as it sounds. Why? Number one, he can't act too OOC or out of character. In the novel that he's in, there's this thing called a system. Imagine a Google system whose only job is to not really be useful to you and just annoy you and tell you each time you try to type out a search term like, nope, sorry, you can't do that. You're not at a high enough level. Or, sorry, you want to know what so-and-so is? I can't help you because you don't have enough experience points. Too bad, too sad. The system pretty much stops him from taking actions that the original Qingqiu normally wouldn't do. And I feel like this is already very interesting because you have this tension of Qingqiu having all of this knowledge of the world that has been placed in. Like, he knows exactly how the plot would go, but he has all these restrictions placed on him, and so he has to find a way to work around that. Second problem, he obviously, as anyone would, wants to avoid being turned into a freaking human stick. So what better way to do this than to, of course, logically treat the protagonist nicely? Because in the original plot of Demon's Way, why Qingqiu ended up having all of his limbs removed is because he tortures the main protagonist of Demon's Way, Luo Binghe. And in the end, when Luo Binghe grows up and becomes a powerful overlord, he, of course, takes revenge on Qingqiu for this by pretty much torturing him. But what happens though when Qingqiu treats Luo Binghe nicely is that this backfires on him and it ends up in the protagonist, Luo Binghe, falling in love with him instead. TLDR, Scum Villain is about a millennial who hate reads a novel, finds himself getting sucked into the role of the villain, tries to be nice to the protagonist only for the protagonist to end up falling in love with him instead, spends the rest of the novel screaming as he tries to avoid the protagonist's advances. Now, with the main plot of Scum Villain kind of out of the way, I'm going to give you more reasons why you should try and give it a read. So I have characters, themes, and coupling. First, let's look into the characters. The thing is, there are so many good characters in the book, but for now, I'll just focus on the main two, Qingqiu and Luo Binghe, Shen Yuan or Qingqiu. Firstly, just saying though, getting transmigrated into a novel where your enemy ends up falling in love with you is goals. Qingqiu is also super genre savvy, which is understandable because he knows the exact plot of Demon's Way. So it's really delightful to see him having all of this knowledge and just keeping up like a snarky running commentary throughout the novel. So he knows all of the cliches and tropes. So he'll do things like, oh my god, this villain is monologuing again.
Nice to meet you.
This world is imperfect.
What?
If only I could wipe away the impurities.
Is anybody else listening to
And
this?
make it as beautiful as me.
Like, why did the villains do that? You know, if they don't tell the heroes all of their plan, like mwahaha, and now I will do this and this and this.
Yes, it was I. My machinations lay undetected for years. For I'm a master of deception.
If they just get straight to it, they might succeed and not actually, you know, give the heroes time to escape. So he has all this snarky comments about the kind of bad tropes that you find in this kind of badly written fantasy novel. Or for example, the clothes that I think I mentioned before. He's like, oh, these girls, like they're fighting and all of your clothes are just like being blasted off for fan service. Or he'll know like, oh no, here comes a side character that's gonna be killed off at any moment. The poor guy, he doesn't deserve this. Or he'll look at some of the other characters and he'll be like, wow, you know, every time the protagonist appears, all of these characters start losing brain cells. They can't function. And of course, it's because in the original plot, it's so the purpose for that is to allow Luo Binghe to be, you know, the smartest and cleverest person in the novel. I also have a soft spot for him just because he's the one that I can relate to the most. You know, with MXTX's other two works, you have Wei Wuxian, who's this super powerful demonic cultivator. You can't relate. With Heaven Official's Blessing, you have this literal god. You know, he ascended into godhood. Can't relate. But with Qingqiu, he's a useless millennial who spends all his time reading novels, ends up being transported into a world where he can actually use all of this, you know, knowledge that he's amassed and manages to also gain a hot boyfriend along the way. Like, yes, goals. Finally, I think the difference between him trying to put on this super cool, elegant facade of being an icy villain who has no feels versus him actually internally screaming 24/7 on the inside, just winging it and hoping that he doesn't get caught by the protagonist and tortured is pretty relatable. Luo Binghe is not only a huge yandere, he's also a huge doem. Two combinations that are mwah, mwah, chef kiss gesture. He has these two opposite sides, like, wow, my man contains multitudes. Not only get you a man who can do both, not only can he be menacing and threatening, but also at the flip of a switch can suddenly turn into this like super cute, cheery, puppy-eyed small boy. He has a huge fear of being rejected, and honestly, who hasn't felt the same way too, you know, from time to time? Despite the fact that he grows into someone who is super powerful, when you read the novel, the reader finds that he's actually plagued by insecurities and self-doubt. He was abandoned by his parents, and later on, he mistakes Qingqiu for doing the same too. So there's this fear of abandonment deeply rooted into Luo Binghe that can't quite go away. He's someone who believes that no one could ever want him or choose him, and for him to slowly learn that, you know, this is not the case in the novel is just, I love canonically how Luo Binghe is also just supposed to be beautiful. Honestly, the most beautiful man ever. That's him. That's him. Like, I mean, look at this. Just look at this. Remember how I mentioned Qingqiu saying that people immediately lose brain cells around him? Well, I understand. I too do the same thing. Luo Binghe also.
My milkshake brings all the boys to the yard.
Boobies. This is definitely a personal preference, but Scum villain features pairing where your old man fuckers at. On a serious note though, if you're into the enemies to lovers trope, Scum villain does this super well. Okay, you have these two people who have all these misconceptions and assumptions about each other, eventually progressing into loving, trusting, and accepting the other, blemishes and all. Instead of me trying to explain the enemies to lovers trope badly, I'm just gonna put in these two quotes by this podcast that I listen to from time to time called Be the Serpent. Okay, I'm just gonna put in two quotes by them that I think outlines what is so compelling in this enemies to lovers trope, which can be applied to Scum villain as well. Okay, so the first quote, followed by the second quote. Finally, I come to the end of my long Scum villain rambling. Sorry, not sorry. Go read Scum villain. If you are into deconstruction of tropes, then this is definitely the novel for you. So Scum villain can actually get pretty meta. I think I mentioned this before, Shen Qingqiu is quite genre savvy, so you'll find him ripping apart into various different kind of cliches that pop up in Demon's Way. And I know some of you might be worried about this. You might be saying to yourself, but I don't know what a stallion novel is, and I'm not too familiar with Chinese BL fantasy novel, so how would I even know what kind of tropes these works have? My dudes, you don't have to worry. I think bad writing and bad cliches are pretty universal, so it's not rocket science. You'll be able to recognize them in the way that Shen Qingqiu does and enjoy the way that he mercilessly rips into all of them. You get to see him snarking on BL tropes, fantasy tropes, and so on. It's also just really satisfying to see all these side characters becoming fully round at once instead of just being, tossed to the side after Shen Qingqiu transmigrates into their world and starts messing the plot line up. I think all of us have been in that position as well, where you read a work or watch a TV show or movie and you're like, oh man, like I really like this side character, but they just end up being pretty much just tossed into the garbage can or dying, and you wish, oh man, I wish the writers had invested more into them and given them something that's a bit more complex or fleshed out. And this is what happens. This is what happens in Scum Villain, where you have all these characters in the original Demon's Way. They're only supposed to be there to pretty much make the protagonist Luo Binghe look good. Like they don't have any other job or any other character beyond that. It's very satisfying to see how they manage to avoid their fates of either getting thrown aside to help Luo Binghe or simply just fade into the background of it without any more sort of complex build up beyond that. It's really satisfying to see all of them get proper plot lines. For me, what is even more, I'm so sorry for using the word, but satisfying, is seeing all these women, and since it is a stallion novel, it's a fantasy harem novel, you have all these women who are only supposed to be rescued by Luo Binghe and pretty much become a faceless number in his harem. All of them also end up having plot lines of their own. It's great. You even get to find out why the original Shen Qingqiu, the villain of the story, became the abuser that he was. And it doesn't excuse his actions, it doesn't try to make you forgive him, because what he did was reprehensible. He tortured Luo Binghe when Luo Binghe was only a young innocent child who didn't know any better. It doesn't try to redeem him, but you find out oh, okay, so this is why he turned out the way he did. To go back to the topic of agency/free will, Scum Villain even manages to problematize the way Shen Qingqiu goes into Demon's Way and pretty much uses the knowledge he has to just, move around all these characters in the world willy-nilly in order to advance his own interests. Shen Qingqiu soon begins to realize that, hey, all these characters are actually living, breathing people. They're not just chess pieces that I can move around. He comes to the understanding that they have wills of their own, and they're actually beginning to grow into people that Shen Qingqiu can't quite predict because of the very fact that he is there. He's sort of butterfly effect style changing the novel, so all the characters and even the plot, they're beginning to move in ways that even he himself can't predict. He soon begins to accept that all the knowledge and assumptions that he has of the world might not actually be 100% true. Scum Villain also manages to delve into, I would say, quite weighty topics. In general, it's quite a humorous novel, but that doesn't mean that it's not able to touch or delve on themes that are a bit, I would say, heavier in nature. So for example, nature versus nurture, or cycles of abuse and why they continue. One of, I think, the more interesting things that I came away with after reading this novel is the idea of why Shen Yuan, transmigrating into Demon's Way as Shen Qingqiu, why was he able to not treat Luo Binghe badly while the original Shen Qingqiu abused him? And I know like a very simple answer for this would be, oh, but you know, it's because he was from the outside. Like he has an agenda of his own. He didn't want to be tortured. He knew what was happening. That's why he could treat Luo Binghe nicely. But beyond this, if you read the novel, I think you can see that the backgrounds, like how Shen Yuan was brought up and how the original Shen Qingqiu was brought up, okay, the way, the lives that they both led, like this had a huge impact on the sort of people that they became. Even for Luo Binghe actually, because in the original Demon's Way, Luo Binghe was definitely not a good person. He ended up becoming sort of a douchey OP overlord with a huge harem who is, let us not forget, capable of cruel torture. He did turn the original Shen Qingqiu into a human stick. So how is it that the influence of the new Shen Qingqiu and Luo Binghe manages to avert him from this path completely? I think does say a lot about how the way a person is brought up and the sort of influences around them that they undergo as they're growing up actually contributes a lot into the sort of person that they become in the end. And finally, for something a little more lighthearted, the last team, Humour. Okay, this might be hit or miss, but I really love Scum Villain's humour. You don't understand. I laughed so much while I was reading this. It brought me so much joy. But while I was laughing though, there was a part of me that was also like, I said to myself, you know, there's something about this humour. I can't quite put a finger on it. It's funny, but in a way that's also kind of lame. I couldn't help thinking, you know what, it takes a very specific sort of person to be able to laugh at this. That was when I came across this one post on Twitter that I think encapsulates it perfectly. It's 90s nonsense humor, like that's it. That's perfectly it. The freaking cheesy 90s like sort of Stephen Chow kung fu movie that I didn't exactly grow up on it, but my dad was a huge fan of this kind of movies. There were certain scenes in the novel that made me think of Stephen Chow. For example, this part where he shaves off his hair and then simply puts it back on again to make a disguise. Or even this tree balls bit. And oh my god, I don't know why I found this so funny. So if you found any of these things even remotely comedic, or you find that the sort of humor in Stephen Chow movies or like cheesy 90s kung fu style cinema is the kind of thing that you're into, then I think Scum Villain will also be right up your alley.